Let me say, I think PAR has a very symbolic or symbiotic relationship with the media. We do high quality, thoughtful research. It's nonpartisan, because I know the media will get bombarded with people like, run this thing that I'm pushing. And we try, to do what we think is the best of Louisiana. I know we get a lot of interaction from people that are just asking us questions. We're also that watchdog on budget issues, on ethics issues, and I know the media really appreciates that as well. I'm mostly going to talk about the budget, but I want to talk a little bit about redistricting, and I want to start just talking a little bit about the future of PAR and my vision for it. We're still going to do in-depth research. We're still going to do those big, massive administrative documents. How many people here read our 90-page review of the Article 7 of the Constitution? Yeah. So, yeah. But I'm still glad we did it. But what we're going to do is up our communication game. We're still going to do those things. Maybe we'll get them down from 90. But we're going to have more shorter, easy to digest documents. So something that people can just kind of read. It's not that far. We're hoping, aiming in the 2, 3, 4 page. And so, for example, with redistricting, instead of last time we did a 20-page report on redistricting, we're doing a series of 3 reports that are each going to be 2 to 3 to 4 pages long, so that people can read it in their schedule, read it on their phone, and try to get the same core information out there, but make it a little bit easier. We also have a much more energetic social media presence. We've had accounts, but now we're actually using them at a much higher level. So hopefully those of y'all that follow social media will notice a difference. We're trying to do more there. I do want to take a second and make sure I acknowledge the reasons that we're doing much better on these things. We have Kaylee right here as our new communication manager, and so she's making sure we get information out to y'all. And of course, Melinda, our new research director, which is to make sure we can get all those pieces out as quickly as we really want to, which really isn't a problem with Melinda. She basically sneezes and she gives me a 4-page report. So it's impressive how much compared to, she makes me look bad as the former person in that spot, which I'm fine with. We're also going to do a lot of initiatives as well. So it's not just the research. We're going to actually do more activities that aren't strictly research. We're going to reach a younger, broader audience. We're going to get young professionals, even college students. We're going to do more on information and education. That's not, so we don't want to have necessarily recommendations in that work. If you're not familiar, we have a Sunshine headquarters. And that's where citizens can go and find out about open meetings laws and their rights as a citizen for public records. And I think a lot of people have used that, a lot of citizens have used that, a lot of the media have used it as well. I want to do something similar with a fiscal headquarters, so we can have budgeting information, the budget process and the tax system. It's a very complicated system. There's no easy one place to get all that information, and so I want to make sure we have that for citizens. The dream is that I have an explanation of the capital outlay process that even a legislator can understand. All right. That may not ever happen, but we'll see. We're going to do webinars. I can't believe during this whole pandemic, PAR has not done a webinar, and so we're going to step up and do that. Speaking of which, then Friday, February 4th at 12:15, we're actually have a webinar on redistricting. So that's going to have Senator Sharon Hewitt and Representative Stefanski, as well as Melinda and myself, and that's going to be the first Friday after the session has started. So we're going to talk about the general issues, but also what's going on and what we're hearing, and we'll hear it from the horse's mouth, because these are the chairs of the committees that have to deal with this. So I think that's going to be very fascinating. I hope we're going to do a lot more in terms of webinars, hopefully once a month. So I encourage y'all to look into that. And then there's a lot of other plans I have in terms of issues, but I'm going to wait until those plans are a little further along. So speaking of redistricting, like I said, we're doing a 3-part series, and the first 2 are out already. Redistricting is a very interesting political issue. I'm borrowing this slightly from Mark Ballard, but redistricting is basically a math problem guided by law. It is, there are things you want to get done, but there are all these degrees of freedom and restrictions on what you can and what you have to do, and so it makes it a very complicated issue. So our first part was just basically an overview, talking about the process, the demographic changes that we've had, the shifts from, for example, from rural to urban areas, and also about the legal and political changes. We now have no requirement for pre-clearance from the Justice Department, which really kind of changes it in very subtle ways that you may not necessarily notice at the citizen level, but it means there's going to be a lot more freedom on the front end. Though we'll see if that's a mixed blessing, because it could be a smoother process in some ways when you had pre-clearance, because you kind of knew that, okay, at least we have some sort of clearance this is going to go through. We also have divided government. You have a governor that may or may not use his veto, depending on how far out of bounds the legislature gets on what his values are. That is very different. And also in our first one had a lot of links and resources to information and tools. You know, this only happens once a year, and technology changes so fast now. It is a difficult issue to follow because it's not just text. But there are so many tools online now of figuring out what's going on, what the proposals are, and making your own proposal. And you get all the shape files and demographics and everything goes with it. I actually had a couple of people give me their maps, just citizens, as well as all the organizations that are out there pushing it. It's really impressive, and I think we've come a long way. Our second issue, on the second part, we talked about the major issues. I think this should be familiar for everyone that's here. Number one is going to be the majority-minority districts. Congress will get the most attention. It always gets the most attention, but you know, at Bessie, with the House and Senate, those are all things that people are going to be looking at to see, can we make those more representative maps and make them more representative of the demographics we have here. Also will be the Louisiana Supreme Court. This is a tough one. You need a 2/3 vote, but it hasn't been changed since 1997. It doesn't need to be perfectly apportioned, so says the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's still the idea that, you know, these things probably, to make all the voters in those districts have sort of equal representation, that their vote would count as much as anyone else. I think there's a lot of thought that this needs to happen, but it's very difficult to get it done. All right, on the third part will be our recommendations, so we haven't put that out yet. Not surprising, our recommendations are going to be for more transparency in the process, and we'll have some specific ways to do that. But like I said, given all the technology that's available, the tools that are available, it's a lot easier for citizens to follow along, but the legislature has to really make sure they're doing their part to make sure the information's available as they're moving through the process, that citizens know what's going on. I've really been impressed by the citizens and the organizations that have actually gone in and done their own work and submitted maps. I mean, that is impressive. All right, so Thursday is when I hope that part will come out, but tomorrow is the executive budget presentation. In fact, later this afternoon, the governor's going to go over some of the highlights of his budget, and that's what I want to spend the bulk of my time with. All right, so we have a disaster, a budget shortfall, then a budget boom, followed by a fiscal cliff. Does that sound at all familiar? Now, the good news is it's not as bad as it was last time in terms of the fiscal aspect. So let's look at some of the numbers. This year, we have a surplus of almost $700 million that can only spend on certain things. We have an additional $850-ish million to be spent in this year. Then next year, we're going to have an $870 million above what we have now. And then we have about $1.4 billion in federal pandemic aid that lawmakers can sort of appropriate. There's actually several other buckets out there, in terms of broadband and education money. There's a lot of information, a lot of money going out through the state. And then in 2025, 2026, we're going to have about a $370 million shortfall compared to next year's budget. That is a lot less than we've had to deal with post-Katrina. And some of that is because we haven't made the problem worse. We have this temporary taxes that are going to be falling off, and we have some shifts, from the sales tax to the Transportation Trust Fund, but we haven't used a lot of one-time money for recurring expenses. And that's where we got into a lot of trouble before. And so I want to make sure that they get the credit they deserve for doing that. I think they've really learned a lesson about using that short-term money for recurring expenses. They may have forgotten a lesson about special legislative projects and pork, but we'll talk about that at some other time. And mostly have done this by putting money into the infrastructure, a rainy day fund, the unemployment trust fund. There's a lot of things that essentially put money into, and I think that's appropriate how they legislate those dollars. But that's the sort of not doing bad stuff. What about doing good stuff? I think there's a feeling that the legislature and Louisiana in general may blow this opportunity. We have billions coming into the state either through from the feds or increased revenue. And it's not exactly that we would waste the money, although plenty of people are going to think that. I'm sure the money will mostly go to good things, but we will pass the opportunity to transform the state of Louisiana. With this much money, we ought to be able to look back and say, okay, in 3, 5, 10 years, how are we different? How are we improved? We have so much we can improve on. What did we do with this money? Okay, so what should we do? And I have 3 things. It's really like 2.5 things, but I'll explain. The first thing is get a plan. And let me be clear about this. Spending is not a plan. If you're going to say, we're going to put $10 million in X, that's not a plan for the future and how you can improve the state. That's just a budget. Now, you need money to do these things, but in and of itself, it's not enough. You need to say what you want to accomplish. What are you trying to accomplish? So, for example, we can recognize that we have a teacher retention problem. So, look, we want to solve or diminish the teacher retention problem or do better with teacher recruitment. And then you can address that through a pay raise. And it might be, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, there might be 2 or 3 other things you want to do in conjunction with that. And say, look, here's this problem, here's how we're solving it, and a teacher pay raise could be a huge part of that. And monetarily, it probably is. But there are other things you want to do. It changes it from let's just put money at something and hope good stuff happens to what's an issue, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and then it lets voters on the back end say, did we accomplish it? Did that actually happen? And that's the accountability portion. Now, secondly, and this is why it's part 2, is we need to put more money in early childhood education. And this is the only individual thing I'm going to talk about that PAR is recommending that we put more money into. And I say a substantial amount of money. And that's because, just like I was mentioning, we've done a lot of research in this area, and I am convinced that this is I think the #1 area that we can really move the needle on so many different issues. Literacy, test scores, graduation rates, job opportunities, healthcare outcomes, public safety. The people that get high quality education years down the road are less likely to end up in jail. So many things. Now, a lot of these are long-term, but it's a lot of long-term things, each backed up with research, peer-reviewed research showing the power of quality early childhood education. But in addition, there's also a short-term benefit because the more children that actually have quality education, early care, that means more parents that are able to go back and participate in the workforce, which we have a problem with now. So it has these amazing long-term benefits, but we have a pretty good short-term reason as well. And I'm thinking along the lines of, I think there's a recommendation that's going to be coming out of the task force of $115 million. That should put around 9,000 kids will be able to participate that can't afford to right now. So you can see that's really a part 2 to the first one. It is a plan. What are we going to do? What do we want to happen? And it's actually going to move the needle. So I think it's really more an example of 1, but I'll count it as 2. Lastly, we need transparency. Mostly I'm talking about the federal money here, but of course we want to do things with the state money as well. I think we need a web portal that shows a one-stop shop where citizens can see what's going on. And there's plenty of examples from other states. I like Georgia as a prime example of a place that's done real well with this. And some of this is already online. In fact, lots of it's already online. There's places you can go on Louisiana's government websites to find out how we're spending CARES money, the local money. There's the water projects, and you can go to a different place to look at that. And there's the broadband program. There's a lot of information there, but you got to go to the broadband page. Then it's not just the administration, the state treasurer. He's put money about the Main Street grants that he oversaw. The Department of Education has the local education dollars. There's a lot of information out there, but it's scattered in multiple places. And I'm glad they have it out there. But for the citizens to be able to access it, I think there needs to be one spot. People are busy, and we need to make sure they can understand it. But it just doesn't need to be a bunch of links. Okay, there's so many buckets of money. And for each of these buckets, I think we need to describe the program and how much money is available to Louisiana. Okay, look, this is what this money is for, and this is how much money we have. Then what's the plan or criteria? This is what the state's going to use, or this is the criteria we're using to award these projects. And I think a lot of this is already there. It's just a matter of getting it and putting it in citizens' hands. And then there needs to be what's been spent or what's been awarded. Sometimes you would award it, and it might take years for that money to actually get spent, but so much is going to this parish to make sure they have water districts or something along those lines. just, list them. In an ideal world, you would make them searchable. So this way, there's one comprehensive place where people can find what they're looking for. I think citizens would appreciate this. I think it would make their lives easier. I honestly think it would make the job of the press a lot easier as well. There's information you can go and get. I think even for state government employees, it would make it better because they're trying to find all this information as well. So I think that makes a huge difference. And I think these steps, get a plan, put a substantial amount of money in early childhood education, and transparency would really help with the concern that we're going to waste this opportunity. I think there's a lot of good effort going on. I just think it needs to make sure that citizens understand what's going on and that we have a plan and that we're actually going to move the needle at that. Okay, with that, open up to question and answer, which is always my favorite part. We have a lot of money coming into the state, and we have a lot of increased revenue, and I think we need to make sure we take this opportunity to move the state forward. We need to have a plan for how that money is used, and we need to make sure that citizens can track actually how the money is used so they can follow up and keep their elected officials accountable.
What about a potential budget shortfall in coming years?
So there will be, if things don't change, there will be some temporary sales taxes that roll off. And so we see there could be about a $300 to $400 million shortfall, a couple of years from now. That's not as big as we've had before, but I do think we need to start planning for that issue, and we need to be wiser for our dollars, use it to pay down debt, or move the economy forward by making wise investments, things like improving the workforce, things like early childhood education, so that when the economy grows enough, we can really have as small a shortfall as possible.
What should the public look for in the upcoming legislative session that starts in March?
This is about redistricting, and so there's going to be a lot of maps, and all of these should be accessible, and that's one of the things we hope the legislature does, is that you'll be able to follow along and see, how does this affect me? How does it affect my congressional district? How does it affect my legislative district? How does it affect my Bessie board? There's all these things that are going to affect them, and you need to make sure that, and we're going to push for making sure that those things are available for people to watch and see how they're affected.
When it comes to redistricting, people sometimes are concerned about gerrymandering. What's your feeling regarding this as we take a look at what will happen?
I am certain that people will accuse other people of gerrymandering because that's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. But it also depends on what you're using this for, and there's different measures of it. If we want to have majority minority districts, then you might have to have some, stretched out districts. Will those go too far? That's going to be an issue for the legislators and the courts to decide.
Tell us a little bit about PAR for people that may not be familiar with your organization.
Sure. PAR is an almost 75-year-old organization that started when Earl Long was governor, and people wanted more transparency, more accountability to understand what was going on. And so that's what we do. We're a watchdog for the citizens. We're a nonpartisan research group that provide recommendations to move the state forward.
How can people get more information?
They can go to parlouisiana.org, as well as find us on social media, and you can find all our reports that we've done and also keep up with what we're doing.